So the title of my presentation is Post-Soviet North Caucasus Factors of Contemporary Ethno-National Identity. And as you'll notice, it looks a lot like what Austin did, and I'm actually very excited that he has chosen to kind of continue this type of field work in another former Soviet location. Just seeing a little bit that I have of his cognitive maps that he collected, they're strikingly similar in some ways to the ones that I've collected in the North Caucasus. So I think we have a pretty good opportunity to maybe uncover some new things. I'll talk to you a little bit first about my research area and the places where I collected my data. The North Caucasus, primarily two territories, Stavropol Krai, Stavropolsky Krai, and the Republic of Karachay-Cherkessia, or in Russian, Karachay-Cherkessia. And you can note that this is in the North Caucasus region, and then those two territories highlighted. Give you a little bit of background on the historical geography of the North Caucasus, especially in the last 200 to 300 years. Prior to 1860, we had a situation, like you'll see on this map here, of Stavropol, right? It was actually established in 1776, and it plays kind of an important symbolic role for Russia and the Caucasus in general. It kind of still signifies that symbolic break between ethnic Russian and non-Russian space. If you talk to many Russians, obviously they have the idea that yes, Russia extends all the way and maybe ends in the Caucasus, right? Stavropol kind of represents that last ethnic Russian territory and that last stronghold, right, or krepis that we find in Stavropol. So here we actually see Stavropol and an independent Circassia. This is prior to the time when the Circassians actually exiled to the Ottoman Empire. But some Circassian remnants exist today in forms of other nationalities, which we'll see. Moving up to 1911, we see three important territories here. We have Stavropol still in existence, and then also the Kuban and Terek oblasts. Kuban and Terek oblasts today encompass most of the autonomous republics that we see in the contemporary Russian federal situation. Moving to 1943, Stavropol and the Cherkessk autonomous oblasts, and this is post-deportation. So as Austin mentioned with the Crimean Tatars, some nationalities were labeled traitor nations by Stalin for alleged Nazi collaboration during World War II. This was the case with some of the nationalities in the North Caucasus as well. The Chechens come to mind as one example of this, but some of the Turkic nationalities were also deported. Among them were the Karachays, which are one of the titular groups in the Republic of Karachay-Cherkessia. During this point, the Karachays leave, the Cherkessk kind of take over the territory in terms of titular status, and we also see a lot of Russians kind of moving in there. Post-1957, we see a Karachay-Cherkessk autonomous oblast actually under Stavropol's administration. So some autonomy for Karachay-Cherkessia, but not complete autonomous status. And finally, after the breakup of the USSR, Karachay-Cherkessia does receive autonomous status under the new federal guidelines. So today it is an autonomous republic. Okay. Also post-breakup, we see something else interesting happen in the mid-2000s in Russia, and these are the creations of these federal districts, or Federalne okrugi. Originally there were 7, there are now 8, as in January of 2010, the Southern Federal District was actually split apart, some of it remaining the Southern Federal District, the area in the North Caucasus actually becoming its own, the North Caucasus Federal District, basically encompassing Stavropol with a bunch of these autonomous republics. The only autonomous republic in the North Caucasus not to be included was Adygea, which remains in the Southern Federal District. Okay. So I'll just show you some pictures from the region, important places that signify historical memory. So for example, this is General Alexei Yermolov. He's kind of gone down in history as the architect of Russian power established over the Caucasus in terms of military efforts. This is an interesting monument in Cherkessk, the capital of Karachay-Cherkessia. It's titled 400 Years with Russia, representing the friendship between Russian and non-Russian peoples of the North Caucasus. Stavropol itself as a city is often thought of as the gateway to the Caucasus, so again, important in terms of its Russian space, but it's kind of this outpost on the borderland, and once you pass Stavropol, you're almost like going into the mountains, you're going into kind of this dikia prirode. An important physical feature in the region is Mount Elbrus, which is actually the highest point in Europe. And it's not located actually in Karachay-Cherkessia, but right along the border with Kabardino-Balkaria. So a lot of the Karachay and Cherkess kind of primordial creation myths about their nationalities encompass Elbrus and a lot of things that have to do with it. So I want you to remember this kind of two-peaked mountain, because that's going to come up in some of these maps. The mountain nations, mountain peoples, Gorsky narody, are often celebrated in this region. For example, this is a picture from the Stavropol State Museum. They have a whole display, right, about each one of these nationalities, its history, or at least its accepted Soviet version of its history. So you can go and see that. All right, so some of my project goals. First and foremost, it was to advance an understanding of post-Soviet territorially based identities among young adults. So I was really interested in people under 30. Not so much Soviet transition, but those who have primarily grown up under the Russian federal system. And I wanted to identify significant trends in group identity factors with quantitative research components. Then, by using theory and qualitative research components, try to explain what these trends mean and why we might see them. So two geographers that I really kind of got some of these ideas from are Herb and Kaplan. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the theory. So the importance of territory for the nation. So territory, according to Herb, and I would agree with this wholeheartedly, provides a tangible evidence for the nation's existence. So it becomes very important for national myths and also for the concept of nationalist in Russia. We also have different forms of identity that we could ascribe to territory or to homelands. We could think of that in civic terms or in ethnic terms, and Russian language is very clear about that break in the Ruski, like ethnic Russian, versus the Rossiyski being a state identity. So Russian by citizenship, but not by ethnicity. And a collective conscience results, right? When one of these groups kind of gets a collective conscience, then we see the creation of a conception of homeland. Kaplan brings in some interesting points, hierarchy of geographically based identities, and I really tried to incorporate that into my project. What is the scope that someone would find in their homeland, and also how do we identify with these different territorial constructions in terms of our ethno-national identity? So how does my cry relate to who I am? How does my city, how does my region, right? How does the federal system work? And also we have dominant nationalist and border identities, and we can find all of these in the Caucasus, since we are talking here about a borderland, right? If there ever were one, I think we have one in the Caucasus. This is the survey that I handed out, and it's very similar to Austin's. So basically just general demographic information, your ethnicity, your gender, your father's ethnicity, your mother's ethnicity. I was also very interested in how people from mixed marriages would represent these things. Birthplace, right? General questions about religion. Do you practice your religion? What religion do you practice? What is your native language? Also mother and father's native language, as those sometimes differ. And then I had them indicate importance of these variables here at the bottom in terms of how they relate to one's conception of nationalist, right? So your birthplace, where you're born, living in the Russian Federation, living in the Southern Federal District, living in the North Caucasus, the cry of the Republic, and then some traditional identity factors, the language, the religion, ethnicity of one's ancestors, also living among members of your own group versus living among members of other groups, which is something interesting to think about. Do we take our ideas about nationalist from our own people, or do we define it against who are not? Right? So I collected my data in parks, public areas in Stavropol and Cherkessk, also villages in the Krai and the Republic. A company where I used to be employed plugins to Alcatel. I used them for, kind of exploited them for some data collection. And then several universities in the region. Okay. So when we bring back some overall mean scores and identity factors, it looks like this. So the most important one in a general sense was definitely native language, followed by ancestry, followed by religious belief. Then we start to get into some of the territorial ones. However, I think it's important to note that 3 being neutral, right, everyone was more than neutral on all of these factors, right, which was kind of interesting. All right, so to further break the data down, I chose to use this statistical analysis called multivariate analysis of variance, or MANOVA. And I broke the data into these independent variables. So nationality, were you Russian or non-Russian? Gender, obviously male or female. Titular status, meaning do you live in a territory that is ascribed to your nationality? So this would be Russians living in Stavropol, they would be considered titular. Karachay or Cherkess in the Republic would be considered titular. There are other ethnicities in the Republic, however, who are not Russian. For example, Nogai or Abazins. So they would also in the Republic be non-titular. And hopefully that makes sense. Religion, so were they Islamic or were they not? Most of the ethnic groups in the study were Islamic. Only Russians, Armenians, and Ossetians actually tend to be Christian. So birthplace, do you live in a city or a village, right? Or were you born in a city or a village? Living place, do you live in a city or a village? Were you born in the same place as your parents, which ends up being pretty important for one's conception of territorial identity? And are you mixed in your ethnic background? So do you have parents of different nationalities? So the dependent variables, as I showed you with the graph, right? You had birthplace, living in Russia, living in the Southern Federal District, living in the North Caucasus, being from a particular Krai or republic, your religion, the native language, nationality of ancestors, and then living among various groups of people. And the ones that I put in bold here had significant differences between these independent variable groups. And the number of significant differences among the groups is indicated by the asterisks. So 2 groups differed in their opinion for birthplace, for example. 3 groups differed in their opinion for living in Russia. And we'll get into those here in a minute. Just to satisfy anybody's statistical questions, right? These data were made normally distributed. If they weren't, based on this skewness value, right, which we see here, then they were transformed so that their z-score met the criterion to conduct MANOVA. Right? So that was some quantitative analysis. Here's some qualitative analysis. So as you saw with Austin, cognitive mapping, right? Basically, a cognitive map is an image of an environment held by an individual or a group. The type of mapping that we've done here is known as free recall sketch mapping. So you give a person a set of instructions, and that set of instructions then prompts them to answer some type of geographical question that we have constructed. And in our terms, it was label your homeland or draw your homeland and label within it 3 places that are most important to you. So how does this work in terms of theory? Well, people get perception from their environment, right? They take in information through perceptual receptors. They then run this information through their perceptual filters and their value systems. So your religion affects how you may feel about this. Where you're from would affect how you would feel about this. Having parents of a different nationality speaking a particular language, right? After that, someone in their mind would produce an image. That image is then, when put on paper, goes through a set of constraints. For example, if someone has a good artistic ability versus if they don't. We saw with Austin's map, some people were pretty accurate. Whether or not they traced it, some were still pretty good. Right? And then your decision about what to draw finally gets to our cognitive map. So, for example, here's a map drawn by a woman from Stavropol, but our Armenian background, Yerevan Armenians in particular. There's kind of a divide in Russia between Baku Armenians and Yerevan Armenians, but that's a whole other presentation. But you can see here as she drew Armenia, she drew obviously some important places, Yerevan, for example, a couple other cities. And you notice that Mount Ararat is drawn in this map firmly within the border of Armenia, right? And if we look at another map, you can see there that Mount Ararat, in terms of what do I do? Which part? didn't touch it. I promise that it's true. I think it's restarting, actually. So anyway, right? Armenia, as we would know, with current nation-state borders, is located in Turkey. Right?
Not Armenia, Mount Ararat.
Or Mount Ararat, sorry.
West Armenia.
Yeah. Right, and it's important it's an important factor for Armenian diaspora politics in general. Do you have a password? Oh, okay.
I think if you use that, then he said, when this happened yesterday, he said we use the remote thing rather than the computer. After you get your PowerPoint back up. For some reason.
It's a nightmare giving a presentation. Get the blue screen of death. The mercy of the hourglass. Okay, well, all right, we'll continue. So basically, I'm going to present the findings regarding those data, which groups were more apt to favor one of these components to the other group in terms of their ethno-national identity, and okay, it's lovable. Just to recap. Okay, good. All right, so these are the breakdowns of actual people of different ethnicities that participated in the study. So see, we have quite a few, and this is because Stavropol in particular is a university town, so a lot of people come from all throughout the North Caucasus region to study there. So we have Abazines, Armenians, Chechens, right, Cherkess, Dargins, Ingush. Dargins are prominent in Dagestan, for example, as are Lezgins, Tabasurans, and also Tatars, Turkmen. Nagais, Russians, Karachay, and Cherkess, and Abazines are the people that historically live in these two provinces. Right? So that's why I've highlighted those. All right. So in terms of birthplace, we saw two significant differences. So people with titular status favored it above people without titular status. And what this MANOVA shows us, it's not necessarily as important like the difference between these two columns. What's important is that the pattern in which people answered is, by these criteria, 95% certain not to be of random chance, right? So we're not talking about the difference in itself in terms of its quantity. We're talking, is there a significant difference or not, right? So keep that in mind. So the birthplace of people who had titular status is more important than people who don't, so which would make sense. If you're born in a place that's ascribed to your ethnicity, you're more apt to take your birthplace as being important for your ethnic background. Also, people born in the same place as their parents favored birthplace. And we're going to see this in many of these territorial categories. People from the same region as previous generations of their family continue to have that connected identity back to the local scope in particular, but also to some other territorial characteristics that are encompassed by being from the same place. So here's an example of a map. It didn't come out too well on the slide, but you can see is with Austin's map, right? You see here the local scope. You can see and also some regional scopes, right? People mapping their birthplace. And then this looks to me eerily similar to one that he put up. We see someone's house, someone's university, someone's workplace. Living in Russia. So as was to be expected, Russians found it more important than non-Russians. Also, non-Islamic people found it more important than Islamic people. And again, people born in the same place as the previous generations of their family found it more important than those who don't have the lineage. And we can see here a map with federal scope with the regional place focus, and this was very common. And also here we've included a physical feature that's important to Russians as a nation, right, like Baikal. This is a Russian man from Nalchik, so the Republic of Kabardino-Balkaria. So you can see here, he hasn't denoted at all his autonomous republic, right, in which he would not have titular status. Instead, he's chosen to draw all of Russia with some detail, right? We see an attempt there at Sakhalin Islands out in the east, also like Baikal, Moscow, and a regional place focus in Stavropol. Living in a Crier republic, this mattered for Islamic versus not Islamic in terms of religion, but interestingly not in terms of nationality, right? So being Islamic meant that living in a particular Cry was more important, right, than if you were Christian or atheist, which are the two primary groups. And again, parents' birthplace back on the board, right? If you're from a Cry republic in previous generations, you tend to more strongly associate with it. The North Caucasus as a region in general, right, again, we see this important break between Islamic and non-Islamic space. So when interviewing a lot of these Islamic peoples, one thing that they would tell me was, we like the North Caucasus because we see it as a space that is safer to practice our religious identity, right? So although you do see a lot of orthodoxy in the region, as with the big Russian presence, they feel as though they can practice Islam in the North Caucasus. Also, in terms of the federal district, right, we see a similar thing. They're more comfortable with it because they have big numbers of their kind of similar religious groups, right? So again, a lot of these people are actually Islamic, and they see less persecution, right, in terms of the place being safe for it. And then again, we see religion, right, in terms of the federal district. So again, the Southern Federal District, as it all was this time, shown as a place that's safer for Islam, right, than other federal districts. So here we can see a regional scope with some local place focus, right? Also, those who were practicing religion, right, tended to prioritize religion, which I think was to be expected. But interestingly enough, those who were practicing religion also said that living among other nationalities, right, was not as important. So those who were not practicing religion tended to look to other nationalities to get their own identity concept. Those who were practicing didn't, and I think that's an important thing to note because so much of the ethnic identity in this area has to do with being Orthodox or being Islamic. Whether or not you actually go is one thing, but if you do, I think it shows that it has an effect on your overall identity. So here you can see some association with political boundaries and religious places. So this is a Karachay woman. She's drawn Russia. She has pointed out Karachay-Cherkessia here, right, as her autonomous republic, blown it up. But we also see something interesting off to the right, and that is that she's put Mecca on the map, right? So included, right, the most holy city in Islam as part of her homeland conception. Between the nationality of ancestors, we saw that it was more important for non-Russians than Russians. And when talking to people, especially Karachais, they have a very strict set of criterion for being Karachay. The nationality of his ancestors being one part. One person told me he knew he was Karachay because 7 generations of his family had been Karachay. And if they had one who wasn't, then he wouldn't be fully Karachay. So this is kind of interesting for finding spouses, right? Potential mothers and fathers of children. Right? Also gender. Males tended to prioritize nationality of ancestors over females. And I think this speaks a little bit to the kind of patriarchal structure that we're going to find in the North Caucasus republics. And again, parents' birthplace important, right? If you're from the same place as your parents, the nationality of your ancestors is also going to be more important to you. So this is an interesting map. Here we see, again, as we saw with Austin's, this broad cosmopolitan conception of homeland, but a focus on the regional scope. And this was quite common for people from the Republic, especially titular nationalities. They would designate their republic without any conception of Russia, kind of showing that being part of Russia, or this Rossiyski identity, is not really that important for me as a Karachay, for example. We also saw a lot of national symbols accompanying national territory. So, for example, we see here Russia with 3 cities in the south, and a matryoshka and a birch tree. I also noticed some lingering sense of the USSR. This was particularly among those people who had been born outside of the Russian Federation and since migrated back. Here's one example from a Russian who was born in Baku. Here we have Russia, we have the North Caucasus where he's living today, and we also have the Azeri SSR, right? Notice that it's not Azerbaijan. It's not the current nation state of Azerbaijan. It's noted as the Soviet Republic, with Baku and also Nakhchivan as part of it. And we see a division between Russia and Karachay-Cherkessia here. So the map down at the bottom, all of Russia with special attention to the North Caucasus and Karachay-Cherkessia, and also this 2-peaked mountain with the sun coming up in between it, right? So. Finally, I'd like to point out participants from the Republic in itself. There's an interesting breakdown. If you look at titular groups within the Republic, Russians within the Republic, and non-Russian, non-titular non-Russians, okay, so Nagais and Abazins, we see several interesting factors. So those who don't have any titular status tended to prioritize the region, not necessarily a defined territory, right? Also the federal district, right? It's kind of this all-encompassing thing, and to me that shows that if you have territory ascribed to your nationality, it does have an effect on how you associate with this place. And then finally, living in the Republic, if you see how the Russians answered that versus the non-Russians, right? It's not important for them at all to live in this autonomous republic, to think of themselves as Russian. So in conclusion, family lineage in one place means territory is more important to you in terms of your ethno-national identity, right? Also, native language was the highest ranking factor. This opinion did not differ among independent variable groups. This was highest in the Russians, it was highest in the non-Russians, right? Everybody ranked native language as the most important identifier. Russian versus non-Russian space, right? This was more important to people than having a particular titular status. Right? Participants tended to draw regionally, even if they ranked these things federally. So they could have said, yeah, being in Russia is the most important, but then when you actually go back and look at what they drew on the map, it tends to be the Krai. It tends to be a city in the region, right? Something like that. And Islamic participants favored regional scope regarding territorially based factors, especially the federal district. And again, this is because they see it as a place that's safer to practice Islam than in other parts of Russia where they don't have big numbers of Islamic populace. And finally, diversity leads to tolerance. In almost every interview that I conducted, people made the comment of Russians, for example, in the North Caucasus are always less racist than other Russians because they deal with these people on a regular basis. They have friends of different nationalities. And also others made similar comments, right? Because we live among these other people, right? We have a chance to see them, we have a chance to interact. And a lot of people feel that although there are problems, obviously, in this region, it is actually one of the most ethnically tolerant places in Russia, which is something that doesn't generally come across in Western scholarship about the North Caucasus. Thanks.